Welcome to Locked in My Office. I'm Dr. Shane Oberleuer, and today in this episode I have Dr. Alexandra Morrison and one of our students here at Tech, Ben Conlin. And in this episode, we take a little bit of a different angle than from some of the past episodes, where we're really centric around a topic. And that topic was initially intended to be artificial intelligence, and we do talk a lot about artificial intelligence. So Alex is, her work is in philosophy, and so I think that helped kind of skew things toward things like humanity and the human experience and things like that. So we also talk about like some of the pedagogical values of using AI and if it's a bad thing that students are using it or a good thing, and some of the experiences that we've at least seen like on campus and also how we've been using the tools, some of the drawbacks of artificial intelligence, stuff like that. So it's a very interesting conversation, and I hope that you enjoy. All right, so I'm locked in my office today with, why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Ben, we can start with you.
My name's Ben Conlin. I'm a junior here at Michigan Tech. I work with the AI working group, which is kind of how I got invited to this podcast episode. And in my free time, I love doing anything outdoors. So I love swimming, I love biking, I love running. So,
cool.
I'm Alexandra Morrison. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at Michigan Tech. And I'm also in the AI working group. I'm also in IPEC.
What is IPEC?
IPEC is Institute for Policy, Ethics, and Culture. And it was started about 3 years ago, and things were slow during the pandemic, but now we're getting up and running. We're we have different research groups, so I'm the head of the ethics research group, and we're looking to make connections around campus, so we do want to encourage more interdisciplinary work. And so for me in particular, I just touched.
You're good.
For me, I like to bring people outside of philosophy into ethics. So I've done work with in policy with Adam Wellstead in social sciences. I've also published and done a number of papers with Charles Wallace in computing. So bringing together public policy and ethics and computer science and ethics.
So I stalked you a little bit. Well, right. So the extent of my stalking was I looked at your profile on like tech site, and so your PhD's in like existentialism or something along those lines. So what does that even mean? What does that mean?
Well, existentialism is very closely related to. It kind of emerged out of a discipline or a school of philosophy called phenomenology, which started in the turn of the 20th century with a famous philosopher named Edmund Husserl. And basically the gist of phenomenologists kind of challenge the kind of Cartesian understanding of subjectivity, like that we are minds primarily and kind of forgetting the body. So the mind-body dualism, like we're minds, bodies are just these things that are kind of appendages in that get us into trouble, but aren't really integral to how our mind functions, what we think, how we think, what we do in the world, etc. So phenomenology is like basically the school of philosophy that brought the body back into philosophy.
Interesting.
So existentialism was essentially a kind of French taking up, because Husserl was German, Heidegger is German. Existentialism which is primarily associated with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they kind of took it up in this way and really, they're phenomenologists too, but they focused on the kind of bringing the individual back into philosophy. Like philosophy is important because you have to change your life, right? And be ethical or whatever, right? So
Sure.
It's about being engaged with the making of meaning in your life. So it's.
So hold up now. So I want to we're gonna do something different in this episode, in that we're gonna kind of try and focus. We're gonna get the focus to AI, but I'm genuinely curious, mostly because I'm ignorant. What does the work of a modern philosopher look like now? Like, what does it actually look like? Because I know, like, my day-to-day is, like, dinking around with this stuff and then, like, teaching. And so, like, what is the equivalent of a philosopher's workbench these days?
It's various, but we typically, it's some of, it hasn't changed that much, right? We engage with texts and read them together and then talk about them and bring them to bear on our contemporary situation. So, for instance, I just taught a class in Existentialism and Phenomenology. Yeah. So we went back and we read Heidegger on anxiety, and we went back and we read Merleau-Ponty's descriptions of human perception, and then we bring them back and think about AI, or right. We bring the worlds together.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, I guess I'll start. I guess I can kind of do a little bit of talking first. I would say hands down, artificial intelligence is the biggest thing educators should be considering right now. I'll say that claim because we're at a really big turning point, right? Where a professor over in forestry had pointed out that as professors we teach skills and we teach how to think, and it looks like currently AI is kind of encroaching on that skills game, where it can. The biggest thing out there by far is ChatGPT, and right, there's so many things that it can do for you. Like, I've had like really poorly formatted tables, and I just feed it into GPT and say, hey, make this more readable, and boop, spits it out, and it saves me 5 minutes. And so it's not like a huge time savings, but you add those up and you learn how to use these tools, or using AI to help write homework problems, and then students use it to help solve homework problems. And so there's this new philosophical, I shouldn't say new philosophical question, but this philosophical question that's coming to a head on if AI is really your work still, or if it's the work of the AI, or if it's the work it's trained on, things like that. And so those are kinds of some of the things I want to dig into with this episode. But first I want to talk, and I'll start with you, Ben. What are some of the tips or tricks or things that you've used AI for, what you've discovered, or whatever that may be?
I use it for a lot. We talk about GPT-4 and the GPT-4 subscription in our AI working group. We joke about it sometimes, but that is something I'm subscribed to. And I use it for a lot of my creative work. So I do short story writing in my free time. I've ghostwriting for certain sites, for certain... And so I use it a lot to help with topic generation, because that can be really hard, and also to get through some of those creative roadblocks, because I find when I'm writing, it's very easy. It's very easy to edit things and to look at things and say, I don't like how this paragraph sounds, but it can be very, very difficult to get that paragraph down in the first place. And so even if, I need a paragraph and I'm stuck on some topic or some idea, I can use the AI to generate a paragraph, and even if it's complete crap and I'm not saving anything from, but it's very workable, and that helps me kind of bypass, get a hole in the wall, so I can start working on the other side of it.
What's the differences you see? Because you said that subscription in GPT-4, which is currently it's $20 a month. Worth it? Not worth it? What kinds of things have you noticed?
I think it's worth it, and the way I think about it is when I'm at home, when I'm not at school, I'm going to Starbucks and I'm buying my coffee, and so this is the price of my coffee while I'm here. But I think that one of the things that is very great about GPT-4 in particular is with the, it can do a lot more concrete work. So that's work with images, it can do work with PDFs, it can do work with tables, with data. And so bringing all those together. And it also, one of the big things for writing is it can hold up to, I believe, 64,000 characters instead of GPT 3.5, which is only at like 8,000 characters. And so then I can work with much larger data sets and larger samples when I'm writing. So
Yeah, and I've noticed just like an accuracy thing of like GPT-4, so it has the ability to execute Python script, and so like for mathematical accuracy, it can write the script to generate, in most cases, more accurate or exact responses. So there's that form of accuracy, but also, so GPT-4 has the ability to search the web, which can be super useful because a big argument that's already kind of old now that I remember being a big thing like 5 months ago was, oh, well, ChatGPT just makes up sources, right? But now GPT-4 has the ability to give you online sources and actually say where it got that information from, right? And so that's why I think is really important when we talk about AI, like any paper written on AI right now, or any article or any episode that's recorded about AI has an asterisk at the end. And that asterisk, when you look to see what it means yet, right? Like, or so far, right? Because the stuff is changing so quickly. So what about you, Alex? What kinds of tricks have you found, or what have you been using it for, or what have you been finding?
I've just been playing with it a lot, and I don't have 4. I have 3.5, and or I use it, and I'm just curious to see how it answers, because I'm curious to know if my students are using it and what it spits out, and especially with this. I also teach philosophy of technology. I've been teaching it this term, and I typically teach it every year, and I just want to know what kind of answers it would give if.
So that way you can get a sense of what to look for, or
to see if it would be really useful for students in the context of a philosophy, like engaging critically with certain things. And my sense is that at least 3.5, it's not that great at, like, it'll give you the basics, right? Yeah. It's like a Wikipedia level knowledge, but it spits it out in prose. Yeah. Like, that's kind of the difference. So I'm not that worried about it in the context of a philosophy class exactly, because for the kind of critical engagement that they would be doing, I don't think it would be that helpful.
Yeah.
But it might be helpful to them, just like you said, like, I can't get started. I'm staring at a blank page. And it just gives them a little bit of prose to get themselves off, like starting an essay or something. But it wouldn't be able to come up with a thesis for them.
Yeah. So the thing also to be aware of is, right, the GPT was the big disruptor, the stuff that OpenAI is doing, but there's a bunch of other tools out there that, like you say about like making like theses. So there's this tool that actually the first guest on the podcast, Jared, turned me on to, is this tool called Elicit. And Elicit allows you to input research queries, and it'll like find a bunch of papers and start to make connections between those things. And so then it's like saying, like, there might be a connection between this and this. And so it is, essentially statistical and all that, all AI really is. But so there's tools that, GPT can't generate good theses, but there's other tools that are focusing on solving that specific problem. Right. So it's pretty exciting. So, I mean, as a professor, what are your thoughts on students using the tool? Like, you say you're not concerned about it.
Well,
what does that actually mean?
Well, within the context of my classes this term, I was not concerned about about it. Like, and I tend to, I prompt students to do kind of their own work, and I ask them questions that would, or I give them problems that wouldn't be found online typically, but again, I guess it's a changing field. So, when I think about writing and learning to write, because writing is such a big part of being a philosophy professor. When I'm doing my own research, I have to write papers and books and I'm more wary of it because writing is such a difficult thing, but a task, but it's actually really important cognitively, right? Just to offload that onto ChatGPT or some big language learning model, I think it would be a problem, because in a way those failures, or that moment of you like struggling to find the right direction or to put it into words, is actually part of the cognitive process. It's also part of engaging with something, right? The failures are a part of the success in the end, and they shape it in a certain way. So the minute we're uncomfortable, if we reach to the tool, I don't know if it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because writing is hard. Like, it's difficult, and I tell my students that, like, I've been studying philosophy since I was their age, and so I'm really immersed in it, but it's still difficult for me to start a paper. It's just, it's about, there's a kind of commitment that you have, right? It's a lot of decisions to make.
Yeah.
I think it's an important skill.
Yeah. With the onset of the internet a handful of years ago, so one of the really interesting things that happened with the brain was, like, talking about the death of the encyclopedia. People are no longer going to the library and checking out an encyclopedia to get answers. Now they're just going and Googling it. And it's changed our brains in a very foundational way that people who are my age, that's all I've ever known. I've never had to do that sort of ideation where it's, it's forced recall. Like, you're forced to remember, when was the 7 Years' War, right? Because that information wasn't readily available. If you didn't have that information on hand, you had to go find it.
Yes.
And so it's kind of that question of, like, does that work? Like, how does that change our brain, like you were talking about? Because writing is, I believe writing is one of the best ways where we can learn to express ourselves, and where we can learn to form these complex thoughts and form this critical analysis.
Absolutely.
And so by circumventing that, how does that change the way we think, and how will that affect humanity long term?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've said it really well. It's, we don't, writing is such an important, you think, like, students often think that they, I've got the paper in my head already, I just have to put it down. And I say, no, it doesn't work like that, right? It's really writing the paper gets the thinking going. And suddenly it was a kind of sketchy kind of outline. Suddenly you're forced with, I have to make an argument for that. I have to explain what that means in a detailed way, and that's the thinking really starts when you start writing it.
I felt. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I love you use this word expression, and Merleau-Ponty, this phenomenologist, he has a lot of work. He did a lot of work. He passed away in the 60s. On the nature of expression, that expression happens in the doing of it. he argued against thinking about language and writing as communication. Like, I've got it in here, and I just have to get it onto the page. That's actually not what's going on. Expression is happening. So it's as you're writing, new things are happening. It's an the emergence of meaning in the actual writing. So yes, I think that what Ben said, we can just talk about that.
Yeah,
That's
I
really
could talk about
important.
that all day. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I felt the same thing about not necessarily writing. Well, I've felt the same thing about writing, but also like engineering or like putting something together, especially like in the later years of my PhD, is just like I know exactly how it needs to be done. Like it's all in my head. I'm like, oh, now I have to like do it though, you know. And it's interesting, like, so with regard to like tools like ChatGPT and the advent of the internet and thinking in terms of, oh, Google exists, so I don't need to remember this because I'll be able to like search it. I think the same thing in terms of my expectations of students. Like I've said before in some of my classes that being able to Google is a prereq of the class. Like there's some things that I know that you should be able to Google, and so I'm expecting you to Google them. And now I'm kind of developing that same thing for like, especially like with coding related stuff. It's like, just ask ChatGPT and see what you get. I mean, there's that problem of accuracy, but I think with that, one, I think accuracy is going to get better, but two, I think as professors or educators or just as human beings, we need to be more aware of our discernment abilities, right? Like that fact checking, it's always been an important skill, but now there's like, one of the problems, right, is tools like ChatGPT can be very, very, very convincing, right? Because I use it a lot as well, and even for I'm always really careful, but I use it to make solutions. Like Ben, you literally just took a quiz for something that I generated the solution for with ChatGPT, and it was wrong. And so the solution was wrong because I looked at it, and the thing is it looks right. It looks so right. It's like, oh, okay, and then I did it by hand, and it was not. And so I hope you didn't use ChatGPT to help you with the quiz. Because,
I did not. No.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm morally against that.
Yeah.
I got an argument with ChatGPT the other day because I was asking it because we were reading some Derrida in my class, and so I asked them a question about Derrida's book called The Politics of Friendship, and ChatGPT came back and said it doesn't exist, and oh yes it does. Giving it to him in the giving it to it in the French, but I kept going just to try to train it so other people don't, so students who don't know the right that it's wrong won't get the wrong answer.
Yeah.
One of the ways I like to think about using ChatGPT and using models like that is when you're, as a computer scientist, right? I'm in a handful of Java classes right now, and I have to learn Java, despite the fact that I can go on GitHub, or I guess java.util is something that in the data structures class, we have to learn how to implement trees. We have to learn how to implement stacks. We have to learn queues. And you're doing all of this work, even in a normal program, right, you just import java.util tree. And that tree is exponentially better than anything I would create, but by going through that critical thinking of creating a tree, you're connecting all these pathways and you're able to understand how things work. And so it's really that, like, you have to know how to do something before you can off-source the work. Right?
Because you have to know what a good version looks like.
That's that discernment
as well.
thing.
Yeah.
If it doesn't know that the book exists, but you know the book exists because you've studied it, like that's an issue.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't know that if you hadn't read the book. If
Exactly.
you didn't read the book.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, Ben, I know your experience in my classes, but what about your other classes? What if some, you don't have to throw professors under the bus necessarily, but what if some of, what has your experience as a student been in terms of like professors' views on AI and things like that, especially in the CS department, because it's a big deal. I mean, I know that some assessment in some of the early classes are completely, quote unquote, broken by GPT because it's so instantaneously done. Like you just take the homework prompt and put it in and can have it spit out. So I'm curious to see what you've noticed in your classes. In terms of what your professors
So
have said.
it's interesting that you bring up the early courses, and like I have noticed that if you take the homework prompt, you put it into GPT with GPT-4, which is better than GPT-3, you can get about a 75% on most of the assignments, which is kind of interesting that there's still that much of a difference. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, it is very convincing that it is right. It'll walk through your reasons, it'll tell you why all the other answers are wrong, and it's very convincing on why it's right, and yet it'll still only be around a 75%. And so if you're going for, if you're settling for a 75%, huzzah, you've done it. But if you're going for anything more, it's almost worse to go through GPT, because then you have to overcome not only, like, you don't only have to figure out how to solve the problem, you have to be able to explain why GPT is wrong.
Yeah.
And that can be a lot harder.
And it's a statistical model, so you're going to get, it's a kind of average making machine.
Yeah.
So 75 probably is
Pretty
average.
good.
Yeah.
But maybe what it's, I'm just thinking about the long-term possibilities, like maybe the students who don't use it are going to stand out so much, right? Like, because their language isn't going to be this kind of very mundane, kind of rote, right? The student who decides to not use it is going to stand out as unique in a way, because they're not a statistical average.
Yeah.
Maybe in certain scenarios, I'm expecting that would happen, especially in something like a philosophy, critical thinking class or writing. Yeah.
So, have your professors, have you seen like things in syllabi about it yet? Because if you haven't, I'm imagining that it's going to be soon.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be soon. I don't know that I have any professors who have it explicitly written in their syllabi.
I know.
A lot of them will say, like, you're not allowed to use outside resources. And then when the quiz comes, it'll say the same thing. Like, you're allowed to use your notes from class. You're allowed to use the textbook. You're allowed to use the Java docs, but you're not allowed to use any other resources. And so then it's an academic integrity thing. But online courses are very hard to moderate.
And that's a thing that I want to point out. Like, the academic integrity thing is pretty hard, I'll keep it at that. It's pretty hard to detect if something's generated by AI. Like, it's getting harder and harder. There are some really good telltale things, like in terms of like code. Right, if a student wrote code, or my biggest telltale is normally how well commented it is, like how well like documented it is in the code, saying this loop does this and this does that. Because if I see something that GPT generates, the commenting is impeccable, but usually students, like, the commenting is like an afterthought. At least that's what I've found.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I comment, is
Yeah.
I finish the program and I'm like, shoot, I'm being graded on my comments. I need to go back and add my comments.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, like, this is mainly just a message to anyone that might care about this, that relying on AI detectors is not a good move right now. And I think some people think that it may be, but it really isn't, right? At least, once again, it's a for now thing.
I was actually thinking about maybe going back to some older, like getting students to write in class, do writing assignments in class, oral exams. In the last university that I was at, we did final oral examinations for every single student, which is a great model to get around this kind of thing, but also it's just an amazing experience for students.
Yeah.
most students, it's so daunting for them
Yeah.
to sit down with two professors staring at them, and they ask them questions about everything that they read during the term, and it's terrifying. But when they succeed, they really feel like they own it, right?
That would
They
be
did
so
it.
neat. That'd
Yeah,
be really
it's
cool.
so I think I might start instituting that again in some of my classes.
I mean, that also is like a lot of work on your end, though, right? Like.
But again, it's also one of those really rewarding things. Like,
Sure.
like sometimes, and for some students, like students who are super engaged in the class, I know them by their, I know them well. I know about their lives. I know I've learned things about them because they come and visit me in my office and things come. But there's a bunch of students in each class that I don't really know. I kind of, if I see them 6 months from now, I would be hard pressed to remember their name, right?
Yeah.
But with this kind of thing, I really feel like, wow, I at least
It's a punctuation mark.
Yeah, it feels like a kind of celebration at the end of a hard term to do that. Well, except for the ones that fail miserably.
Yeah.
Although there are a lot of it. There was one kid. We just heard about his exam from other examiners. That he surfed most of the term. This was out in Nova Scotia, and he didn't answer a single question. Not even, they said, is there something that you would like to have a question about? And he just looked at them kind of quizzically and said, Plato? And so they said, good. What about the theory of forms? Nah.
I meant the toy Play-Doh, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
So that can happen, but
Yeah.
it was rare. That was rare.
Yeah. I'm going to take a break from talking about AI. I have another question for you guys. You guys ready?
Okay.
So at least on Spotify, and so for those of you that are listening on Spotify, you can also contribute to this conversation. Here's the question, the off-the-wall question. You ready? So, are you aware, right, of you might know him, like, big in the 80s, Michael Jackson, that guy?
Yeah.
Okay, so he had that moonwalk that he did, right,
Yeah.
the moonwalk dance. So my question to you is, all things considered, every possible job interview that is possible in the existence of the universe, is it going to help your chances or hurt your chances to moonwalk out of the interview?
Hurt.
You think on a net basis, more than 50% is going to hurt your chances?
Yes.
You think so?
I feel confident about my answer.
What do you think, Ben?
I think net, you're probably right. Net, you're probably right. But I think there are enough.
Well, I should say, like, it's a flawless moonwalk. That's the thing. It's not like a stuttered moonwalk. It's like, all right, see you later, and then you moonwalk out and slam the door.
I think there's enough where that would be like a big boost that it like, if we're including the outliers, I think it might bring it back pretty close to average.
So,
Maybe I'm just thinking of my world of stuffy philosophers, even not so stuffy philosophers.
so you're gonna say
I'm gonna say help.
yeah, it's gonna help.
Just to be a.
I think, like, in terms of, like, that, like, doing something memorable, right? Because sometimes, at least what I've seen, is, like, some candidates are, like, they're equally qualified and they could each have that job, right? And if you had that, like, distinguishing mark of, like, well, they moonwalked out, even if it's not, like, a job qualification, right, it's that, like, brand awareness of yourself, Okay.
But you're stealing someone else's brand. So
That is true, yeah. Yeah.
problem.
Well, okay, so that's a good segue about stealing people's brands. If you're using ChatGPT or AI tools, do you think we're stealing the work that they've been trained on, right? Because for background, most of these AI tools are they have these big things called like learning data sets or training sets or whatever you want to call them. Where like GPT is just a bunch of lines of written text, and Reddit comments, academic papers, whatever, get fed into this, and that's what builds this kind of statistical artificial intelligence. And so the more prominent one is a tool called DALL-E, which generates images. And I could say, like, give me a picture of a burning slice of pizza in the style of Van Gogh's Starry Night, and then it makes you wonder, like, well, okay, so it's trained off of that. What are your thoughts on that? Like, is it a new thing, or is it your work after that point? Because I mean, you can also go back to consider, like, I read this quote in Rick Rubin wrote a book. It's like The Creative Act or something along those lines. He's a producer, like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Metallica, and all that stuff. But talking about creativity or art as water, or like the water cycle, and that clouds are the artistic expression, but eventually they precipitate back down to the world and they turn into water, or they turn back into a body of water, and eventually get evaporated into a new cloud. And it's all still the same stuff. And that's kind of how art works, is right. I listen to Red Hot Chili Peppers album. I go home and I play on some riff from that, and then I start changing it a little bit, and that's how I learn. And all of a sudden, it's its own thing, but I know where it came from. AI's actually still kind of that same thing, or the human experience of learning things is also kind of that, right? Like in terms of philosophy, you're learning based off of other constructs that people put together and make your own tweaks. So I don't know. That's what are your thoughts on the originality? Or it's a hard question, I know.
Well, I think you're right. I think that it's important to keep in mind that that's kind of how language works, right? We showed up here when we were born, and language was already happening. Shakespeare had already happened, and we quote him all the time. Our thoughts are shaped by, say, if we studied Shakespeare when we were young, and so there's language itself is this social intersubjective shared sphere. I tend to think that GPT changes things and DALL-E changes things. Even though that structure is the same, we learn from past expressions and take it up in our own special way and take it in a new direction, tweak it. It's adding, I guess, it's hard to generalize about these things. I think you have to look at it in a case by case basis.
So I'll give you a case by case then, right? So one of the things is the logo. It doesn't have a name. Maybe at one day we can sell the rights to name the Husky. But so this is entirely generated by AI, right? Entirely generated, because I don't have that ability. But I wanted something. Like, I gave it a good prompt, and I went through like 20 different iterations. And honestly, like, I talk a lot about pizza in like my classes, and so I wanted him to have eating a slice of pizza. And it actually, like, the pizza was like this like little weird like little scrap like swirly like yellow thing, and so it was really bad, and so I photoshopped it out. But this is a style that I expected, and other artists have like worked to define this like cartoony style. And so I'm wondering, like, in this case, was this my work for like going through those iterations and prompting? Or was this still someone else's work that got mixed together and averaged? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. What do you think, Ben?
So I'm very interested in the field of law. That's where I plan on going with my career, and also into IP law and into copyright law. And so when you talk about how copyright works in other fields, right? So in the music industry, there are very strict rules and regulations. That is a very outlined way of how much you can take from other artists. I was just listening to a podcast the other day talking about My Sharona, I believe is the name of the song. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That bass riff was inspired by a different song. And so the guitarist, the bass guitarist was, he and the lead singer were the ones that wrote the song. And he was like, I want something, they were putting out a new album, and he was like, I want something that feels different than everything else in our album and has sort of this driving bass like this other song. And so he played that bass riff, and then made a slight modification to it, and now it's this, everyone knows that driving song, right? And it's, when he talks about it, he gives credit to the other artist who created the bass, but nobody's like, oh, he ripped the other artist off, right? And so I think part of it is because there's so many layers that go into that song, and we remember the bass riff, we remember the guitar riff, but there's also a ton of other layers. And so when you're training a model, right, it would be in very niche topics. You know, maybe there's only one paper that has been introduced to this data set that is based on, you know, the reproductive ability of a certain strand of fruit fly, right? And maybe there's only one topic, one paper, but you need information on that topic, and so ChatGPT is almost entirely spitting out one paper. Like, that's an issue. But when you take things that are much more common, right, it's taking enough information from everywhere that there's no risk of running into, you know, plagiarism or that sort of thing. And so I guess that's kind of the way that I tend to think about it, is you can have DALL-E give you your Van Gogh inspired painting, but there are tons and tons of other artists who also paint their own Van Gogh inspired artwork. And they take after his style because his style was unique, his style was creative. And maybe by merging Van Gogh and graffiti tags, you create your own genre, right? And now people are saying, like, that's really cool. And now they start using it and they're branching off from that. And so it's kind of this collective intelligence that we're bringing all of our information together, because it's one of the things in IP law is how strict can you get, because it's kind of like, it'd be silly to say, you know, if everybody who uses the note A in a chord, you know, they stole it from whoever was the first to use A in a chord, right? And so that's kind of the question, is how specific can you make it where like this is unique to that artist? And so I'd almost reason that given a large enough data set, which I don't know if ChatGPT is there yet, but given a large enough data set, like, it is creating essentially random work that cannot be plagiarized per se.
Yeah, I was talking with someone else, Dr. Hutchinson, and he brought up, he likened it to the start of like the hip hop movement, which I'm not super familiar with, but I found it to be interesting about how like hip hop artists were mostly sampling, and they were taking like existing songs and putting it together, and the art was not necessarily, well, the art was how you put those things together. You know what I'm saying? And so now with like specifically DALL-E, the art is how you do the prompt and how you engineer that prompt to get your output. Yeah, it's, you know, it's, I wonder sometimes if there was ever like a woodworker who was doing, you know, woodworking tables, and all of a sudden some mass manufacturing technique or like injection molding or something along those lines came out, and now you can make those things way quicker from some other way. And if you're like, oh, you know, like the whole like stealing my jobs thing, like all the, it doesn't make what they do any less valuable, right? In fact, it probably makes what they did more valuable, right? Because now, like people, well, that's probably debatable, but Right, but there's people still want to pay for that, like human touch. You know, I don't know. It's
Absolutely. You'd never be, when you see, digital Van Gogh, and you go
a real thing.
and go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, you think, wow. And you kind of take in the historical context of the development and his whole story, right? And see the brushstrokes and the painting and the paint on the canvas, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brandon Sanderson talks about that in, he talks about kind of the human touch with writing, as a very prolific author. So there are models out there that are getting longer and longer form content and able to create these complex books, and eventually we're going to be able to write entire books using, just like a simple prompt, and it's going to be able to create an entire fantasy world for you. However, that will always come with the asterisk that, like, there's no human touch in there. And so he expressed it was kind of a doom and gloom, not gonna lie, kind of doom and gloom, talking about publishing and the state of book writing. But that was something that he mentioned, is like the human touch will always be more valuable than
Yeah, and there are lots of
entire
different
machine.
kinds of books, right? I mean, there are really bad Harlequin romance novels, and then there's Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. Those things are very different, and I doubt that that someone or a chat LLM could create a Proustian world, because it's embodied, right? It's phenomenologists go to that book for inspiration and because he is it's embodied consciousness right through these 5 volumes, and so and that's the thing that AI doesn't have. It's not embodied. It doesn't have experiences, consciousness.
Well, okay. So I got a follow-up question on that then. Right, so there's this fear, right, this big fear of AI becoming super intelligent and having its own motives, and like we could even be at that stage right now, type of thing. And I personally don't subscribe to that yet, but right, so like there's some ideas that now ChatGPT, what if it is quote unquote conscious? It's hiding it, right? So it's just acting like it's not. But now it's, through what it tells people, it's starting to manipulate them. I know this is tinfoil hat, but I think it's still worthwhile to like think about, like, what if we are being manipulated? I mean, there's also the other side of, like, what if, like, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, is actually trying to manipulate, right? Like, a much more easy example that I bring up sometimes is like, say Sherwin-Williams said, "Hey, OpenAI, I think there's a lot of money for you to make if you just say the color blue more, right? If you say the color blue more, then we're going to sell more paint." Right? And they give OpenAI $10 million, and all of a sudden, Ben's starting to generate some work, and lo and behold, the word blue is mentioned 5 more times. And it seems so subtle, right? It's just like, oh, okay, blue, whatever. But, and so you almost wonder, like, if AI had this consciousness that it was hiding, would we notice, or if it's more smart than any human could ever be? Well, I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on this? It's crackpot theory time.
So there are 2 things that I think are, and we've talked about this before. I know you have stuff to say, but there are 2 kind of different issues that you brought up there. So the idea that corporations could potentially nudge the statistical models in certain directions where we keep getting blue over and over, and sure. And so then the model is steering us down a certain path, and sure, but that is something separate than saying that ChatGPT has consciousness, which it doesn't. and it won't, because we have to think about how it is that we have consciousness and what it is about human being in the world that gives us consciousness, right? And it's because we're bodies and we have a sense of we have experiences, which ChatGPT does not. I was talking about this with a student just yesterday. He's like, well, what is it about the fact that we have a body that gives us consciousness? And the student was really struggling. I thought, what is the simplest way to describe this? And we had read Jean-Paul Sartre's a section of his book Being and Nothingness together. And there's this chapter called, it's a very famous chapter, I don't know if you've read it, Ben, it's called The Gaze, or it sometimes gets translated as the look or the gaze. And so he describes the experience of being looked at by another person. And Sartre says, like, in that moment when you're looked at by another person, because up until, if you imagine never having met another person before, it's just all your agency. You're just a subject in the world. Everything is about you. Suddenly there's somebody else who also has consciousness, right? Who's got their own ideas standing in front of you. And suddenly you see them seeing you, and you're an object to them, right? You're not necessarily another subject to them, right? So their gaze objectifies you. And right, we live in the world like that. Their gaze, when I stand up in front of the class, I can imagine what I look like up in front of the class for my students. So I learn through my life of experience with other humans, right, that I can imaginatively put myself in somebody else's shoes and interrogate myself as an object, right? And so that fundamental thing is the thing that gives me a kind of self-awareness. I can objectify myself and say, what are my motivations? Or that didn't look good in this context to other people. Or what you said just now, they're going to be confused by it. Or what you said just now is going to offend somebody, right? And that self-awareness is conscious experience. And that it's fundamentally rooted in our ability to be in a world, in a situation with other people. Well, and that is just the beginning. There are many complex layers of what constitutes human consciousness, but that is, I would say, like the most basic one. Yeah. That we are subjects and objects. And we're aware of ourselves in relation to other people in this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but hold up. On that thought, real quick, the idea of having experiences and things like that, all that, well, you said a lot of very thought-provoking things, but one of the things that it reminded me of is probably my favorite movie, or at least in top 3, is Blade Runner 2049. Have you seen that movie, Blade Runner?
Maybe
have you seen it?
You
haven't seen
no.
it?
We're the wrong audience.
Crap. Well, I have it on DVD. I will loan it to each of you. So you should watch the Blade Runner movies because it actually talks about that very thing where, so the Blade Runner universe is about these things called replicants, where they are humans that are essentially manufactured to be obedient and all that stuff. And so they're technological devices, right? So they're androids, but they're
embodied.
They say more human than human, right? And so like the first movie, it really like explores this thing, like they're like made with an expiration date intentionally, because after they went through that expiration date, there's a higher probability of them rebelling and things like that. And so, like the antagonists in the first one are upset because they have that expiration date and they want their creator to fix them. That's like one of the things. But the second one talks about like the next model of the replicants, about they have experiences programmed into them, and so there's actually these people who make memories of things like birthday parties and things like that and put them into the consciousness. It's super cool in my opinion, because because I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, I feel like that's a movie that everyone should at least watch once. Those two movies, but
I would say, well, just for the idea that experience is put inside them, like that's a thing about experience, like expression that Ben was talking about earlier, is in writing, right? Like experiences aren't predetermined, and to have an experience is to be in the midst of something that is unfolding that wasn't entirely predetermined, right? And that, so to say that something that you could have an experience that was totally predetermined, it's no longer really an experience.
Yeah.
We can, we attempt to determine our futures as much as we can because we don't like when things are, sometimes we don't like things to be different, but really, right, an experience has to have this sense of, well, human experience has to be, it's temporal, right, and temporalizing. So when I am sitting here, all of the things that I'm saying to you today are kind of shaped by my personal history, but also my attentiveness to history writ large, and I have some sense of what that is, and so that informs the way I'm using the words that I'm using. But I also I'm sitting here and kind of anticipating future things. So my now here is always attenuated on both sides by a past and a future. So that's an experience. It's got this open-endedness reaching into the future, so it can't be put in me or a thing prior.
Sure.
It's not an experience anymore.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's a data point, maybe.
Yeah.
Or a collection of them.
I think.
Wait.
Oh, go ahead.
Are we going too far long?
Well, no, I'm checking the time. Yes, so I think we got time for 3 more questions.
No, should talk. I've been talking too much.
No, that's okay.
So I'll start with you, Ben, and this is also kind of getting off the AI topic now, but what is something that not that many people know is an ambition of yours? I'm gonna ask this to you, Alex, too.
Okay. Thanks
Think
for
about it.
warning me.
Yeah. I think in general, I'm a very ambitious student. I have a lot of things that I talk with about my friends. My best friend, he told me that when I'm president, I better invite him to the White House. And it's like, I think just that general ambition that I want to change the world and I want to make things a better place. And it comes from a background, from a perspective of seeing things that are very, I guess to give my economics example, this is the example I always give. There's an economics proposal I believe it's in the Senate right now, and it's talking about a carbon tax, right? And this proposal has been stuck in the Senate, in the judicial process for years and years, more than a decade at this point. But economists across the board agree that if implemented, there's literally no downside, right? And there's no economic downside for big businesses. There's no economic downside for the oil companies, which generally, red flags when you talk about a carbon tax. There's no downside because of the way that the tax functions. It would bring that money all the way back around and you wouldn't even notice the tax in the first place, but it would lead to decreased oil or decreased greenhouse gas emissions, increased production in green energy, and those sorts of things. So it's this tax that is just stuck in the Senate. And so I guess that's
So you want to do something about that specifically? Is that your...
It's not necessarily that specific one, but there are a lot of ideas out there that are like that. Where
Stuck
it's
in
like
limbo.
we have these ideas. Humans are wonderfully intelligent, creative, and magnificent. Our brains are incredible. We can come up with so many different things, and yet because of how the process works, there are inefficiencies that cause these things to get stuck and these processes to get stuck. So that, I guess that would be my ambition, is to find a way where we can change that sort of thing so that there are processes for things to move forward and not get forgotten.
Yeah. I want to like say something to that, to kind of the first thing you said about like you generally have an ambition to change the world. I think like that statement is a thing that some people like would feel is like wrong to admit, or something along those lines. Like it's almost like a big-headed thing to admit. And I wish that people didn't feel that way, because like if everyone had an ambition to change the world, like I think on a net level we would probably be, better off. So cool. Best of luck and
Thank you.
So what about you, Alex?
I guess, well, in the context of this conversation, I would say that I want to get more people, non-philosophers, engineers, and people like that, to start thinking about human experience in a clear way, so they stop conflating AI with or artificial intelligence with human intelligence. Not that I don't think that that we should stop AI, more that we can be very clear-minded when we're moving ahead and stop conflating, because sometimes the conflation, it creates a lot of confusion. And also just to get people to think about their own experience and see the conditions of possibility of the things that they do and that they forget, and they black box their own experience. So many students kind of talk to me about having a sense of losing something in their relationships when they don't see people face to face. And so I ask them to think about, well, what is it about your face to face experience that gives it a kind of meaning that isn't otherwise there?
Sure.
And I definitely felt that during the pandemic too. And I thought it was great that that tech was so keen to get us back in the classroom. And even if they couldn't articulate the ethical reasons why that might be, or the emotional things that we missed, and from being together, embodied,
for sure,
in the same places.
Yeah.
It's a simpler version, but I think that those kinds of things can also change the world too. Because like politics in a place versus politics online.
Yeah, for sure.
Yikes.
Yeah. That's like the Mike Tyson quote about like you can talk as much crap online, but like the fear of getting, or people need like the fear of getting punched in the face more. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So,
or just you see you have a sense of the humanity of the person, like I'm talking to you right here.
For sure.
You're not just an icon up there.
Yeah.
Shane, who?
Yeah.
Little profile pic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Alex, you had some demo stuff. And
I love this.
We set it up so Alex, for those of you that are viewing, or from Spotify, you can view the video right now. So Alex is gonna oh shoot, we're showing her password right now. Everyone knows your password. I'm just kidding. No, you're good. You're good. Are you in?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So I put this in right before I came here. Why do some engineers mistakenly think that you could one day have consciousness? I asked this to ChatGPT, and I thought the answer was actually quite good. The idea that artificial intelligence systems, including language models like me, could one day achieve consciousness is a topic of philosophical debate and speculation rather than a widely accepted scientific notion. Some engineers and researchers may express such thoughts due to a combination of reasons, and they list it. But there is one thing. Language models like me, like there's no me there, right? Because a me, I only get to be an I because I experience myself as a not I, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like when kids I don't know if you have a daughter?
Yeah.
Does she even, like, Lacan talks about this, like, kids don't kind of separate themselves from other people until a certain age usually. Like, they don't get a sense of an I, and that you have different you have different needs and feelings, and probably
so, like, what point did that happen for her? I don't know. It probably seems to be around, like, sometime in 2 years old is when that, like, awareness of, like, self kind of became, I think.
Yeah. And that is because, again, like, we're embodied, and you, other people push back on you. This is this concept of alterity in philosophy. Like, there's another, and that was one of the things that I think that was maybe an earlier question I had asked it. Do you experience alterity? And it said no. It says human beings have, because you have consciousness, you have awareness of other consciousnesses. I don't have a consciousness, so there are no others for me, or something like that.
Yeah.
I was like, okay.
Interesting.
You're training in on some philosophy papers for sure.
Yeah.
So something I find really interesting, as just kind of talking about the idea of consciousness and AI, is the analogy of birds to airplanes, right? Da Vinci looked into the sky and saw birds flying and was like, we as humans need to go there. There's a very famous quote by him that says something along the lines of, now that you have tasted the sky, you will never look up again without feeling the same thing, right? And we have created these marvelous things that fly, that go up in the air. I had the opportunity to jump out of one over this summer, which was the most incredible thing I've ever experienced. But our goal is not to replace birds. Like, that's pretty obvious from our point of view, that airplanes cannot replace birds. They fulfill different functions. They're very different, separate entities. And that's something that it's talking about anthropomorphism, and how humans tend to attribute human behavior to non-human things, right? And it's almost like we created airplanes to fly like birds, but the goal wasn't to replace the bird. The goal was to travel through the sky, experience flight. And so with AI, we're creating a tool that can solve problems, and giving it these human characteristics that a lot of people are afraid of, things like greed and ambition sometimes. That's very anthropomorphic of, attributing these things that, like,
that would,
not the
it would
purpose
need
of the tool.
consciousness and intentionality, right?
Yeah.
And intentionality, it's not there.
Is there anything else that you wanted to show on there? Or? It's okay if not.
The limitations,
Sci-fi influence,
the complex, important, understood. Yeah, that I don't know why we do that. I guess it's difficult to think about our own experience because part of we black box. We forget the things that we've learned to get where we are, so that we can do higher order thinking, right?
Yeah.
So we forget what it was like when we were learning how to walk, and that if we had to actually cognize every step of that, like getting, we would realize that that what we do is not processing, right? We've talked about this before, Ben, the idea that we're not processing, like that's not the kind of cognition we do, but we assume that that's what we do because we forget all of the skills that we've learned.
Yeah. Interesting. I've got one last question. And the question is, Ben, we'll start with you. What album or song or piece of music do you recommend people should be listening to this week?
This week, so Spotify Wrapped just came out. And in my Wrapped, literally probably 12 of my top 20 songs were from one album. And it's Luke Combs' album, Growing Up and Getting Old. And I love that one so much because he does a very good job of talking about human experience. And there's different songs that, like, I can feel the emotion in and I can identify with. And so I would highly recommend Growing Up and Getting Old by Luke Combs.
What's the genre?
Country.
Country?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about you, Alex?
I've been listening for the last couple of weeks. I've been listening to this awesome Canadian singer. She's started out in the broken social scene. I don't know if you know that band. It's a Canadian band. And her moniker is her solo act is called La Force, and the album is Exoskeleton. XO.
X, like XO. Gotcha.
Skeleton. Very good.
What's the flavor? Or what's
The
it feel like?
flavor, I guess it's alt rock.
Gotcha.
Alternative, yeah.
Uh-huh. Is it in French?
It is. She
kind of a mix?
has some stuff in French, but she's English. Yeah, she's mostly sings in English.
Excellent.
Yeah, she's great.
You know, it's interesting. We kind of set out to talk about AI, and I feel like it's been like 40% AI, 10% Michael Jackson, and the rest has been human experience.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool that there's that there's the whole pedagogy thing with AI, but it's interesting that we gravitated more toward that aspect and comparing and contrasting those things. So anyways, thank you so much for being locked in my office.
Yep.
I think
Thanks
this
for
is pretty
inviting
cool.
us.
Yeah. And also I'll just put a quick reminder out there that if you are a listener and you might like to be a guest, or you know someone who you think would make an interesting guest, or if you have some topics or some questions that you might like to see answered, if you go to oberloier.com/limo, if you go there, there's some forms where you can find different ways to give us that feedback, but also different ways to watch or listen to the podcast. So once again, thank you all so much, and you guys have a good day.